You've been giving away your power your whole life, and you didn't even notice it. Every time you reacted to someone who didn't deserve it, every time you explained yourself to people who were never going to understand, every moment you let someone pull you out of your peace, just to prove a point that was never worth proving. It didn't feel like weakness, it felt justified, it felt necessary. But slowly, quietly, it trained you to live at the mercy of other people. The Stoics understood something most people still miss. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the real battle is never out there, it's within. Not controlling what others say, not correcting every misunderstanding, but mastering the impulse to react at all. Because the moment you stop needing to respond, to defend, to explain, something shifts. You become harder to reach, harder to shake, harder to control, and that kind of presence doesn't ask for respect. It creates it, quietly, without effort, without noise. It's the kind of control that doesn't need to prove itself, because it's already there. You don't notice how much of your life is controlled by reaction until you slow down enough to actually see it. It starts small. Someone says something slightly off, nothing obvious, just enough to create friction, and suddenly your mind isn't yours anymore. It starts replaying the moment over and over. You analyze tone, you question intent, you build responses you wish you had said, you refine them, you rehearse them, and while all of this is happening, you're gone. You're not present anymore. You're trapped in something that already ended. That's the cost most people never calculate. Reaction doesn't just affect the moment, it steals your awareness, and once your awareness is gone, control follows. This is where the shift begins, even if you don't realize it yet. Because control was never about dominating situations or proving points. It was about holding your internal state. The moment your emotions are shaped by someone else's words, something changes. You may still look composed on the outside, but internally you've already adjusted yourself to them. And the strange part is, it feels justified. It feels like you're doing the right thing, like you're standing your ground, but in reality, you're reacting on terms you didn't choose. You're stepping into a dynamic that was set for you, not by you. And every time that happens, even in small ways, you reinforce a pattern. A pattern where your peace is something that can be interrupted at any moment. Over time, that pattern becomes invisible. You stop questioning it. You start assuming this is just how life works. People say things, you respond. People challenge you, you explain. People misunderstand you, you clarify. And without noticing it, you've built a system where your energy is constantly being pulled outward. Your attention is scattered across things that don't deserve it. Your peace becomes conditional. And that's where most people stay. Not because they choose it, but because they never step back far enough to see it clearly. They don't see that the disturbance isn't coming from the situation, it's coming from how they engage with it. The Stoics saw this differently. They understood that not everything deserves a response, that not every comment needs to be answered, that not every situation requires your involvement, and more importantly, they understood that your control exists in the space between what happens and how you respond. It's a small space, easy to miss, but it's always there, and inside that space is your freedom. The problem is, most people move too fast to notice it. They react before they think. They speak before they choose, and that space disappears. But when you slow down, even slightly, something changes. You start to see the impulse before the action. You feel the reaction forming before it takes over, and in that moment, you have a choice. That choice is where everything begins to shift. You don't have to react. You don't have to explain. You don't have to engage with everything that comes your way. And when you start exercising that choice, even in small ways, you begin to take something back. Your attention becomes more focused. Your energy becomes more stable. You're no longer pulled into every situation. You're deciding which ones deserve you. And that selectiveness changes how you move. You're not avoiding life. You're refining how you participate in it. At the same time, your perspective starts to evolve. You begin to see that most of what people say or do isn't really about you. It's shaped by their own experiences, their own limitations, their own way of seeing the world. And once you understand that, the need to take everything personally starts to fade. You don't feel the same pressure to respond. You don't feel the same urgency to correct or defend. You start to realize that not being understood by everyone isn't a problem. It's normal. And chasing that understanding often costs more than it gives. There's also a shift in how you use your silence. Before, silence may have felt like weakness, like something you fell into when you didn't know what to say. But now it becomes intentional. You choose it. And when you choose silence in moments where reaction is expected, it creates something most people aren't comfortable with: uncertainty. There's no feedback, no emotional signal, no clear reaction, and that absence changes the dynamic. Because now, instead of you thinking about them, they're left thinking about you. Not because you're trying to control them, but because you didn't give them what they expected. But this doesn't mean withdrawing from everything or becoming distant. That's where most people misunderstand the idea. You're still present, still aware, still engaged, but you're selective. You don't give your attention freely. You don't respond automatically. You choose when to speak, when to step in, and when to step back. And that selectiveness creates value, because what is always available is rarely appreciated. But what is controlled, measured, and intentional carries weight. It creates a different kind of presence, one that doesn't need to prove itself. And as you continue to operate this way, something deeper begins to form. You're not just avoiding negativity, you're redefining your standard. Every time you ignore something that doesn't deserve you, you reinforce a quiet boundary. You remind yourself that not everything is worth your energy. And over time, that standard becomes part of how you move. You don't have to think about it. You feel it. You recognize what aligns with you and what doesn't, and you act accordingly, without hesitation, without explanation. That's where discipline comes in, because your mind will still try to pull you back into old patterns. It will still push you to react, to defend, to prove. But now, you notice it. You see the trigger before it takes over. You understand where it's coming from, and instead of following it, you observe it. That awareness weakens its control. It creates distance between you and the reaction. And in that distance, you regain stability, not by suppressing emotion, but by not being ruled by it. And eventually, you reach a point where you no longer feel the need to act in every situation. Not everything requires your response. Not every comment deserves your attention. Not every conflict needs your involvement. And in that restraint, something powerful happens. You conserve energy. While others are busy reacting, explaining, and exhausting themselves, you're building, you're focusing, you're moving forward without interruption. That's the quiet advantage. No noise, no distraction, just control. If this way of thinking resonates with you, don't let it pass like everything else. Stay with it. Build on it. And if you're serious about moving this way, consider subscribing. Not as a routine, but as a decision. A commitment to think more clearly, to react less impulsively, and to live with more control than you did yesterday. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because now you're no longer just communicating, you're seeking validation. You're trying to correct someone else's perception of you, hoping that if they see you clearly, they'll respond differently. And in doing that, you've placed your sense of clarity in their hands. You've made their understanding a condition for your peace. That's where the imbalance begins. Because the truth is, people don't misunderstand you in a neutral way. They interpret you through their own lens, shaped by their experiences, their beliefs, their insecurities, and their expectations. What they see isn't just you. It's you filtered through everything they already are. And that means something important. No amount of explanation guarantees alignment. You can choose your words carefully. You can clarify your intentions. You can repeat yourself in 10 different ways. And still, They may not see what you're trying to show them, not because you failed to explain, but because their perspective isn't built to receive it. This is where most people get stuck. They assume that more effort will fix the gap, that if they just say it better, more clearly, more patiently, eventually it will click. But often it doesn't. And the more they try, the more energy they lose. Over time, this becomes exhausting, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, draining way that wears you down without you noticing. You start anticipating misunderstandings before they even happen. You rehearse explanations in your head. You overthink your words, your tone, your timing. And instead of speaking freely, you start speaking defensively, not because you're being attacked, but because you're trying to prevent being misunderstood. That's how deeply this pattern can settle in. It reshapes not just how you communicate, but how you think. There's also a hidden consequence that's easy to overlook. The more you explain yourself unnecessarily, the more you teach people that you need to. You create an expectation that your actions, your decisions, your thoughts all require justification. And once that expectation is established, it becomes difficult to step away from it. Because now, silence feels like avoidance. It feels like something is missing. But in reality, silence is often the clearest boundary you can set. It says that not everything needs to be explained, and not everyone is entitled to your reasoning. This is where a different perspective begins to take shape. Instead of trying to control how others see you, you start focusing on how you see yourself. You begin to understand that clarity doesn't come from external agreement. It comes from internal alignment. When you know what you meant, when you understand your intentions, when you're grounded in your own reasoning, the need to explain starts to fade. Not because you don't care, but because you're no longer dependent on someone else's interpretation to feel stable. There's a line from Epictetus that captures this shift perfectly. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And when it comes to being misunderstood, the reaction most people default to is explanation. But what if the more controlled response is restraint? What if the strength lies not in saying more, but in knowing when enough has already been said? That's where the balance begins to return. You're no longer chasing understanding. You're choosing when it's worth pursuing. This doesn't mean you stop communicating or that you become distant. It means your communication becomes intentional. You explain when it adds value, when it clarifies something that genuinely matters, when the other person is actually open to understanding. But you stop explaining as a reflex. You stop doing it out of discomfort, out of fear of being seen the wrong way, out of the need to correct every misinterpretation. And in that shift, something important happens. You reclaim your energy. There's also a deeper layer to this. When you stop over-explaining, you begin to see how often people project their own assumptions onto you. You notice how quickly conclusions are formed, how easily intentions are assigned, how little effort is sometimes made to actually understand. And instead of trying to correct every one of those projections, you allow them to exist without engaging with them. Not because they're accurate, but because they're not yours to manage. That realization creates space. Space to think clearly, to act deliberately, to move without constantly adjusting yourself to fit someone else's perspective. It removes a layer of pressure that most people carry without realizing it's there. And once that pressure is gone, your interactions start to feel different, lighter, more direct, less complicated. At the same time, your sense of identity becomes more stable. It's no longer shaped by how well others understand you. It's anchored in how well you understand yourself. That stability makes you less reactive, less defensive, less inclined to overcorrect. You don't feel the same urgency to be seen a certain way because you're not relying on that perception to define you. And this is where the connection to control becomes clear again. Just like with reaction, explanation can quietly shift control away from you. Not in an obvious way, but in a subtle, ongoing exchange where your energy is constantly directed outward, trying to manage how you're perceived. When you step out of that pattern, when you stop explaining by default, you bring that energy back inward. You use it to strengthen your own clarity instead of trying to fix someone else's interpretation. Over time, this becomes a habit. You pause before explaining. You ask yourself whether it's necessary, whether it adds anything, whether the other person is even in a position to understand. And if the answer is no, you let it go. You move on without filling the silence, without correcting the narrative, without chasing resolution where it doesn't exist. That restraint doesn't make you less expressive, it makes you more precise. Your words carry more weight because they're not used to defend every detail. They're used when they matter, and because of that, they land differently. People pay more attention, not because you're saying more, but because you're saying less with intention. In the end, the shift is simple, but not easy. You stop trying to control how others interpret you, and you start controlling how you respond to being interpreted. You let go of the need to be fully understood by everyone, and you focus on being clear within yourself. And once that becomes your foundation, misunderstanding loses its power to disturb you. There's a different way to move through moments that usually pull you in. It doesn't look dramatic, it doesn't feel loud. In fact, at first it almost feels unnatural. Someone tries to provoke you, maybe with a comment, maybe with a tone, maybe with something subtle enough that only you catch it. And instead of reacting the way you normally would, you pause. You don't respond. You don't correct them. You don't show anything on your face that confirms they reached you. You simply let the moment pass without feeding it. That silence, in that exact moment, changes the entire dynamic. That absence creates something most people aren't comfortable with: uncertainty. When there's no reaction, no emotional signal, no clear feedback, the other person is left with their own interpretation. They start questioning what just happened. Did it land? Did it matter? Was it ignored on purpose? That lack of clarity becomes a space their mind tries to fill, and the more they think about it, the more their attention turns inward, away from you and toward their own assumptions. There's a kind of psychological pressure that silence creates, not through force, but through absence. People are used to feedback. They rely on it to navigate interactions. A reaction tells them where they stand, whether they crossed a line, whether they succeeded in getting a response. Without that feedback, they lose their reference point, and in that uncertainty, their confidence in the interaction starts to weaken. They're no longer in control of how the moment unfolds. What makes this even more effective is that it requires no effort beyond restraint. You're not trying to outsmart anyone. You're not crafting the perfect response. You're simply choosing not to participate in something that doesn't deserve your energy. And that choice, repeated consistently, builds a different kind of presence. One that isn't easily pulled into unnecessary exchanges. One that doesn't react on impulse. One that remains steady, even when tested. There's also something important happening internally when you practice this kind of silence. You're strengthening your ability to sit with discomfort without acting on it, because the urge to respond doesn't disappear immediately. It's still there, pushing you to say something, to correct, to engage. But when you resist that urge, even briefly, you prove to yourself that it doesn't control you. And that realization builds confidence. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that doesn't need to be displayed. Over time, this changes how you experience interactions. Situations that once felt tense or draining start to feel neutral. Comments that would have stayed with you for hours lose their impact. You begin to see how much of your previous stress came not from what was said, but from how you responded to it. And once that becomes clear, the motivation to react starts to fade. It no longer feels necessary. There's a line that captures this idea with precision. No man is free who is not master of himself. Freedom, in this sense, isn't about controlling others or shaping every interaction to your liking. It's about maintaining control over your own responses, even when the situation invites you to lose it. Silence becomes one of the simplest ways to practice that control, not because it avoids the situation, but because it prevents the situation from controlling you. As this approach becomes more natural, people begin to notice the difference, not always consciously, but they feel it. There's a shift in how they interact with you. Some may test it, trying to get a reaction, pushing a little further to see if the pattern holds. Others become more measured, more respectful, because they sense you're not easily drawn in. And in both cases, the dynamic has changed. You're no longer responding automatically. You're choosing when and how to engage. As Seneca put it, "He who is brave is free." This doesn't mean you never speak or that you avoid every confrontation. There are moments where a response is necessary, where clarity matters, where silence would only create confusion. But those moments become easier to recognize when they're not buried under layers of automatic reaction. You respond when it's intentional, not when it's triggered, and that distinction is what keeps your control intact. That filter is what most people lack. They move through life open to everything, responding to every comment, every message, every shift in energy around them. And because of that, their attention is constantly scattered. Their presence is diluted. They're everywhere, reacting to everything, but never fully grounded in anything. It feels like participation, but it's actually a loss of direction. Because when you're available to everything, you're controlled by anything. That decision-making process is where your power begins to return. Because now, instead of being pulled into interactions, you're stepping into them intentionally. You're not reacting, you're choosing. And that choice creates a different kind of presence, one that isn't easily predictable, one that isn't constantly available, one that carries weight because it's not overused. There's a noticeable difference between someone who is always accessible and someone who is selectively present. The first becomes expected, their responses are assumed, their time is taken for granted. The second creates a sense of value, not through force, but through scarcity. When your presence is not guaranteed, it becomes something people pay attention to. Not because you demand it, but because you've set a standard without saying a word. This is where most people hesitate. They worry that stepping back will be seen as disinterest or disrespect, that if they don't respond quickly or engage consistently, they'll lose connection. But what often happens is the opposite. When you stop overextending yourself, when you stop being constantly available, your interactions become more meaningful. You're no longer engaging out of habit or obligation. You're engaging because it matters. That shift also changes how you experience your own time. Without the constant pull to respond, to engage, to be present everywhere, you create space. Space to think, to focus, to move at your own pace. And in that space, your actions become more deliberate. You're not rushing from one interaction to the next. You're choosing where to invest yourself. There's a line that reflects this idea with clarity. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. When your attention is spread across too many things, when your energy is given freely without consideration, it doesn't just affect your interactions. It affects your entire sense of time. It feels like there's never enough of it, not because it's limited, but because it's being used without intention. As you become more selective, that sense of time begins to shift. You're no longer reacting to every demand placed on you. You're deciding which demands are worth your response. And that decision creates boundaries, not rigid ones, but clear ones. Boundaries that protect your focus, your energy, your ability to stay grounded in what matters. This refinement doesn't make you less connected. It makes your connections more intentional. You're not spreading yourself thin across every interaction. You're investing fully in the ones that align with you. And because of that, those interactions carry more depth. They're not rushed. They're not distracted. They're present. There's also an internal shift that happens alongside this. As you become more selective externally, you become more stable internally. You're not constantly adjusting your state based on what's happening around you. You're maintaining a consistent center, regardless of external noise. That consistency makes it easier to stay focused, to stay calm, to stay in control. Over time, this way of operating becomes natural. You no longer feel the need to respond to everything. You no longer feel uncomfortable with silence or space. You begin to trust that not every situation requires your involvement, that not every moment needs your input. And that trust allows you to move through life with less friction. The idea of control, then, becomes less about managing others and more about managing yourself. It's not about influencing every interaction. It's about choosing which interactions you step into. It's not about being present everywhere. It's about being fully present where it matters. And in that selectiveness, something changes in how others perceive you, not because you're trying to create an image, but because your behavior reflects a certain level of discipline. You're not easily pulled in, you're not constantly available, you're measured. And that measurement creates a sense of respect, even if it's not explicitly acknowledged. At the same time, your own perception of yourself begins to shift. You start to see that you don't need to be involved in everything to be relevant. You don't need to respond to every comment to maintain your position. Your value isn't tied to how often you engage, but to how intentionally you do. You're still in the world, still interacting, still connected. But now there's a structure behind it, a sense that your presence is directed, not scattered, that your responses are chosen, not triggered. And that difference, while subtle, reshapes everything around you. And that decision has consequences, not in a negative sense, but in a natural one. When you raise your internal standard, your external environment begins to adjust. Some people will notice the change immediately. They'll feel the difference in how you respond or don't respond. They'll realize that certain behaviors no longer get the same reaction from you. And without that reaction, those behaviors lose their effect. They either adapt or they fade out. This is where your internal standard begins to shape your external reality. You don't need to push people away. You don't need to explain your boundaries. You don't need to justify your choices. Your behavior does that for you. The consistency of your actions communicates more clearly than any explanation could. It shows what you accept, what you ignore, what you invest in, and people respond to that, whether consciously or not. There's also a sense of clarity that comes with this shift. When you stop engaging with what's beneath your standard, your focus sharpens. You're no longer distracted by things that don't matter. You're no longer carrying conversations, arguments, or thoughts that add nothing to your direction. That mental space becomes available for something else, something more aligned, more constructive, more intentional. Over time, this clarity strengthens your sense of identity. You're not constantly adjusting based on external input. You're operating from a consistent internal position. That consistency makes your decisions easier. It removes the hesitation, the overthinking, the second-guessing. You know what aligns with you and what doesn't, and that knowledge reduces friction in your daily life. There's a line that reflects this idea in a simple but direct way. Associate with people who are likely to improve you. It's not just about choosing who you spend time with. It's about choosing what you allow into your space in general. Conversations, environments, interactions, even thoughts. When you filter these through a higher standard, your entire experience begins to shift. At the same time, you begin to notice how much of your previous engagement was unnecessary. Situations that once felt important start to look trivial. Reactions that once felt justified start to feel excessive. And that awareness reinforces your decision to operate differently. It's not about avoiding life. It's about engaging with it more deliberately. There's also a quiet confidence that develops from this approach. Not the kind that needs to be displayed or validated, but the kind that comes from knowing you're not easily pulled into things that don't serve you. You trust your ability to choose. You trust your ability to step back. You trust your ability to maintain your level, regardless of what's happening around you. At the same time, your relationships become more aligned. You're no longer maintaining connections out of habit or obligation. You're engaging with people and situations that match your standard. And because of that, those connections carry more value. They're not based on constant interaction, but on meaningful interaction. The process isn't instant. It requires consistency. It requires awareness. It requires the willingness to let go of patterns that once felt normal. But each time you choose not to engage with something beneath you, you reinforce that shift. You strengthen that standard. You make it clearer, both to yourself and to others. At that point, ignoring what doesn't deserve you is no longer a strategy. It's a reflection of who you've become. None of this is easy. It sounds simple when you hear it, almost obvious, but the moment you try to apply it, you feel the resistance immediately. Because your mind is not naturally built for stillness in the face of pressure. It's built to react, to defend, to justify, to prove. That impulse has been reinforced over years through habits, experiences, and expectations. So when you decide to move differently, you're not just changing your behavior, you're going against a pattern that has been running automatically for a long time. This is where most people stop. They feel the reaction, they justify it, and they act on it. But the Stoics approached this differently. They didn't just observe their reactions, they examined them. They looked at what triggered them, what caused the emotional shift, what underlying belief or expectation was being challenged. Not to excuse the reaction, but to understand it. Because understanding changes how something affects you. When you start asking yourself why something bothers you, the answer is rarely as simple as it first appears. It might seem like the issue is what someone said or did, but often it's connected to something else. A need to be respected, a desire to be understood, an expectation that wasn't met. And once you see that, the situation starts to lose some of its intensity. Because now it's not just about what happened, it's about how you're interpreting it. This is where discipline and awareness begin to work together. You notice the trigger. You feel the reaction starting to build, but instead of moving with it immediately, you step back, even slightly. You question it, not in a complicated way, but in a direct one. Why does this matter to me right now? What is this actually affecting? And in that moment of reflection, something shifts. The reaction loses its urgency. Over time, this process becomes more natural. You don't have to force yourself to pause. It happens automatically. You begin to recognize patterns in your own behavior. You see which situations tend to trigger you, which types of comments affect you more than others, which environments pull you into reaction. And with that awareness, those triggers start to weaken. Not because they disappear, but because you understand them. Understanding removes a lot of their power. When something is unclear, it feels overwhelming. When it's understood, it becomes manageable. And that's what happens with your triggers. They go from being automatic responses to being observable patterns. You see them as they are, without immediately acting on them. And that space between awareness and action is where your control grows. This doesn't mean you stop feeling. You still experience emotions. You still notice when something doesn't sit right. But the difference is, those feelings don't dictate your behavior in the same way. You're not pulled into action by them. You're aware of them, but you're not controlled by them. And that distinction is what creates stability. Stability in this sense isn't about being unaffected by everything. It's about not being easily moved by things that don't deserve that level of influence. It's about maintaining a consistent internal state, even when external situations shift. And that consistency makes you less predictable in the best way. Not because you're trying to be unpredictable, but because you're not reacting in the expected way. There's also a level of freedom that comes with this. When your triggers no longer control you, your options expand. You're not limited to one type of response. You're not locked into a pattern of behavior. You can choose how to respond or whether to respond at all. And that choice gives you flexibility. It allows you to move through situations without being tied to a specific reaction. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." At the same time, your interactions become more intentional. You're not responding out of habit or impulse. You're responding because you've decided it's worth it, and that decision is based on clarity, not emotion. It's based on understanding, not reaction. That shift makes your responses more effective, more precise, more aligned with your actual intentions. As this becomes part of how you operate, people begin to notice the difference. They may not understand it fully, but they see that you're not easily provoked, that you don't react the way most people do, that certain things that would normally cause a reaction don't seem to affect you in the same way, and that creates a different kind of presence, one that feels steady, grounded, controlled. This presence isn't something you perform, it's a result of the internal work you've done, the examination of your triggers, the discipline to pause, the awareness to understand what's happening beneath the surface. It's built over time, through repetition, through consistency, and once it's there, it doesn't need to be maintained in a forced way. It becomes natural. There's also a shift in how you view other people when you reach this point. You begin to see that their actions, their words, their behavior are often driven by their own triggers, their own patterns, and instead of reacting to them, you observe them. Not in a detached way, but in a way that recognizes what's actually happening. And that recognition makes it easier to stay grounded. This is where indifference takes on a different meaning. It's not about not caring. It's about not being controlled. It's about choosing what affects you and what doesn't. It's about maintaining your position regardless of what's happening around you. And that kind of indifference is not cold, it's stable. It allows you to move through situations without being pulled into them unnecessarily. It allows you to engage when it matters and step back when it doesn't. It allows you to maintain your energy, your focus, your clarity. And over time, it becomes the foundation of how you operate. Because in the end, the goal was never to eliminate emotion or avoid interaction. It was to understand yourself well enough that your reactions are no longer automatic, that your behavior is no longer dictated by external triggers, that your state is no longer dependent on what happens around you. And once that becomes your reality, control is no longer something you're trying to achieve. It's something you already have. At some point, something shifts in a way that feels almost invisible at first, but changes everything once you notice it. You no longer feel the same urgency to respond to everything around you. Situations that once pulled you in immediately now pass by without that automatic need to engage. Comments don't carry the same weight. Tension doesn't demand your participation. And what used to feel like something you had to address now feels optional. That realization is subtle, but it marks a turning point. Because once you see that not everything requires your response, you begin to move differently. This shift changes how you experience time and energy. When you're no longer reacting to everything, you stop spending your mental resources on things that don't matter. You're not replaying conversations. You're not thinking about what you should have said. You're not carrying interactions with you long after they've ended. That mental space, once occupied by reaction and analysis, becomes available. And what you do with that space determines the direction you move in. When you step out of that pattern, the difference is immediate. Your attention becomes more focused. Your actions become more deliberate. You're not switching between distractions. You're staying with what matters. And that consistency creates momentum. Not the kind that looks dramatic, but the kind that builds steadily over time. You're no longer reacting to what's happening around you. You're directing your energy toward what you've chosen. There's a line that captures this idea with precision. If you seek tranquility, do less. It doesn't mean you become inactive. It means you remove what's unnecessary. You stop doing things that don't contribute to your direction. You stop engaging in situations that don't add value. And in doing less of what doesn't matter, you create space for what does. That's where real progress begins, not in doing more, but in doing what matters consistently. This approach also changes how others interact with you. When you're not easily drawn into every situation, people begin to recognize that your attention isn't automatic. They see that you're not reacting in the expected way, and that creates a different dynamic. Some may test it, trying to see if they can still pull you in. Others may adjust, becoming more intentional in how they approach you. But in both cases, the pattern has changed. You're no longer responding on impulse. At the same time, your own sense of control becomes more stable. You're not constantly adjusting your state based on what's happening around you. You're maintaining a consistent direction, regardless of external noise. That consistency makes it easier to stay focused, to stay calm, to stay aligned with what you've chosen. You're not being pulled, you're moving. There's also a sense of quiet confidence that develops from this. Not the kind that needs to be expressed or proven, but the kind that comes from knowing you're not easily distracted. You trust your ability to stay on course. You trust your ability to ignore what doesn't matter. You trust your ability to maintain your focus, even when there are opportunities to lose it. And that trust removes a lot of internal tension. As this becomes your default, your progress begins to look different. It's not loud, it's not reactive, it's not driven by external pressure. It's steady, controlled, and consistent. You're building without interruption. You're moving forward without being pulled sideways. And that kind of movement, over time, creates results that are difficult to replicate through constant reaction. There's also a shift in how you view conflict. You begin to see that not every disagreement needs to be resolved. Not every comment needs to be addressed. Not every situation needs your involvement. And by stepping back from unnecessary conflict, you conserve energy that can be used elsewhere. You're not avoiding conflict. You're choosing which ones are worth your time. This selectiveness reinforces everything that has been building. You're not reacting, you're not explaining, and you're not engaging with what doesn't align with you. And in that restraint, you create a kind of efficiency. Your actions are no longer scattered, they're directed. Your energy is no longer divided, it's focused, and that focus becomes your advantage. Over time, this advantage compounds. While others are caught in cycles of reaction, explanation, and distraction, you're moving forward without those interruptions. You're not spending energy on things that don't contribute to your direction. You're not losing time to situations that don't matter. You're not carrying unnecessary weight. And because of that, your progress is cleaner, more consistent, more sustainable. This doesn't mean your life becomes empty or quiet in a negative way. It becomes clear. There's less noise, less distraction, less unnecessary involvement. And in that clarity, you're able to see what actually matters. You're able to focus on it without interruption. You're able to build without being pulled away. At the same time, your presence becomes more grounded. You're not reacting to every shift in your environment. You're not adjusting your behavior based on every external input. You're stable. And that stability is what allows everything else to function more effectively. Your decisions are clearer. Your actions are more intentional. Your direction is more defined. Eventually, this way of operating becomes natural. You don't have to think about whether something deserves your attention. You know. You don't have to force yourself to ignore distractions. You simply don't engage with them. You don't have to remind yourself to stay focused. You already are. And that natural alignment is what makes the difference sustainable. Because in the end, the goal was never to control everything around you. It was to control how you move within it. And when you reach the point where not everything requires your response, where not everything deserves your attention, where not every situation needs your involvement, you've achieved something that most people spend their lives chasing without realizing it. You've created a way of operating that allows you to move forward without being constantly pulled back. At the end of all this, it comes down to something simple, but not easy. Your peace is not something to negotiate. It's something to protect. The moment you stop reacting, stop explaining, and stop giving your energy to what doesn't deserve it, you take your life back in a way most people never do. If this message stayed with you, don't let it fade here. There's another video on your screen right now that will help you go even deeper into mastering this mindset. Watch it and keep building that control. And truly, thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal.